In this exercise, we're going to take a look at using the IMVU toolkit for Blender to make a simple animated pose. We can access the toolkit, View, Sidebar, so View, Sidebar, and there is the toolkit. So all we need to do is click on the tab, and we want the animation tool. So that's where all the animations are created using the animation tool. So furniture, avatar poses, everything is done basically within the animation tool. So open and then click on the append animation file button, and that will open the avatar. So as with a static pose, we've got the avatar meshes, which is what we can see. So this is the female. Same skeleton for both female and male avatars. They use exactly the same skeleton, same animation system, same rig. And this, all this wiry stuff, that's the control rig. And this is what we use to actually pose and animate a character, all these outlines. But right now it's in object mode, which basically means that we are selecting the object itself. What we want is to be in pose mode, and for that we want to be in the mode selector, pose mode. So click on that, and the colors of this will change. That indicates or confirms that we are in pose mode. We can now select individual elements of the rig and pose them. And by that we mean we select a component, and using either the widgets, oh, don't use that one. No, yes, we do use that one. We don't use this one, scale. So we use move and rotate depending on what we're doing, because what we can do, or we use the shortcut keys, which is the letter G, G for grab, and R for rotate. So once we've got something selected, we just press the G key and we can freely move or manipulate our bone. So that's G to move, R to rotate. So what we want to do here before we actually do an animation is ensure that auto key is set. And this will save us some steps, because if this isn't set, we have to manually insert the keyframes, so that is the data that's associated with the position of this element relative to the rest of the rig. It'll insert a little keyframe in the timeline. So if we don't have this set for automatic insert, we have to do that manually by pressing the I key, or pose animation insert keyframe, and it will give us a list of options. What we generally want, if we're doing it this way, in the pop-up, is location and rotation only. So that's what we would normally do. And it drops in a keyframe. But with auto key enabled, all we need to do is just move this, and it will drop in that data and update it if it's being replaced. So let's do a quick pose. So that's our first part of our animated pose. And of course we've got, as we were saying, our keyframes. So for an animation, what we want to do here is move the timeline scrubber, so that's this blue thing, move that to another frame, and it will snap to the individual frames. So let's go with frame 10, and we want to select a different set of bones, let's say the shoulders. Grab, grab, move those two up. So the avatar is shrugging. So what we now have is if we click drag the scrubber back and forth between those two frames, it'll animate, but we also need to make sure that when we adjust a bone at one frame, that there is data associated with that same bone in another keyframe, otherwise it won't show any change. So what we can do is select the bone that we've manipulated and click on zero bone. Don't click on zero pose, that will reset the entire pose. We just want to reset the individual bone. But when we do that, we want to make sure that the timeline scrubber is at the key frame, so the frame that we want to insert or reset in this case our bone data. So scrubber at frame 1 and then click on zero bone. So that's dropped in a keyframe and it's zeroed the bone. So essentially that's reset it back to its original position. So do that with both of them. So now we have a shrug. And then to complete the process, move the scrubber to frame 20. You can adjust the timing later. So what we want to do now is just reset these bones, and or we can copy paste the pose at frame 1 to frame 20. Either or works. But if we do it the copy paste way, we have to select the bones that were modified. So we've selected them. From the pose menu, we want copy pose. So pose, copy pose. So that's Command C, that's the shortcut. So copy pose, move the scrubber to frame 20, and then pose, paste pose. So that's Command V. That drops the pose in, and it also drops in the corresponding keyframe data. So now we have an animated pose. But what we can do here is two things. We can change the length of the sequence. So right now the animation length is set to 50. So that's 50. We can adjust that and then lengthen the animation, as in how long it takes for the sequence to play out. Click type 60. So that's 60 frames, 30 frames per second, so this is 2 seconds long. So that's made an adjustment to the timeline. So all we need to do is move this set to the end to be our end frame set. So we want Option, click, and that will click select the frame set. So that's the markers for the entire frame at that frame count. So this is at frame 20. So what we're doing is grabbing all the inserts associated with the individual bones that we've posed. And then what we can do is just grab those and move them. So press the G key. They will automatically snap to the timeline and drop that at frame 60. So what we can do here is play around with the length of the sequence and how it plays out. So let's say we want the shrug to last a couple of frames within the sequence. So Option, click, press the G key, just move that to frame 20. And then what we can do also here to copy paste, so this is an alternative way to copy paste, is to select that frame set, then key, copy keyframes. So again, that's Command C. So key, copy keyframes, move that to frame 30, so the scrubber, and then key, paste keyframes. Now we'll drop those in. So what we have is a shrug that lasts a few frames and then resets. And that is essentially the basis of making an animated pose. So what we're doing is essentially creating static poses at specific frames, but because there's several of them along a timeline or a length duration, we essentially create an animation. So it's this combination of these poses along a timeline, which means that we're creating an actual animated sequence. So now that we've got that, we can save this. File, save as, Mac Blender for animated pose. Return, save as, and then all we need to do now is just export this, and we use the tool for that. So scroll down the tool, there's the export button. So we need to go back up to the top just to double check, make pose, export all bones. That's what we want. If we want to replace all the bones of the default avatar. So what this means is that it will only export the bones that have animation data in the timeline, or if that's set, it will export everything, which will then override the default pose. And this is useful for combining poses together. So if we leave this blank unchecked, it'll only export these bones, this frame data, these posed bones, which means that you can combine this with another sequence. So you could have a walking animation, so the avatar is walking. You add this pose as a product on top of that animation, and it will trigger this pose in combination with the one that's actually playing, the walking. So to export, all we need to do, so we don't need to set any of that, motion control, that's fine. Length 60 frames, 2 seconds. All we need to do is click on export, and the toolkit will do the rest and export an animated sequence we can import into Studio. So click the button. It's done the thing, get a confirmation, and the timeline will typically change. That confirms everything's done. All we need to do now is import this into Studio. So in Studio, what we're going to do is create a product from the empty mood. This gives us a quick way to test whether the animation actually functions. Because the avatar is essentially stripped of any animated data, it leaves us with a clean avatar that we can import our animated sequences into to test, to make sure that they actually do work and there aren't any issues with the animated sequence itself. So we want to create a new product, and we want to derive by a PID. And we want to derive from 10,945,930, which is the empty mood. So click on that, select. We'll get a preview of basically the default avatar standing around doing nothing. Then we just click on derive. That will show us our base avatar, and it'll be dressed relative to your inventory. So we're just using the default base avatar, the bobblehead. So all we need to do now is import the FBX. So import FBX, browse to the location of the FBX that was exported, which will be this one. It's appended animation control armature action. Whilst we're here, what we might want to do if we are doing several poses, because it exports the FBX using the same name. So to make sure that we don't override that, Before we export, make sure the rig is selected, and that will activate control armature action. We can rename this one, leave the one with the hyphen or the minus sign, don't touch this one, we want to edit this one. So control armature, we can rename that. Save the file and re-export, and we should find our animation exported with an identifiable name. So back into Studio, there it is. There's the same sequence, but because we've edited the name, it's given us something that we can easily identify. So click to select, open. Now we go through the import process. So set up FBX. So we don't need to change anything here, so that's okay, that's okay, that's okay. Skeleton, that's okay. We don't want this, so because it's meshes, we don't want to bring any meshes in. Next. No materials. So disable. Don't want any of those. Next. This is what we do want, but we don't necessarily want morph shrug. That's the facial animation data, so we don't want that. So uncheck. Review. And this is what it'll bring in. Anim shrug. So import, complete the process. It's brought in our data, so now we need to create an action. So component, action, new action. We'll call this, now this is the empty mood, so the intention of this product is that it's supposed to play the animation as soon as it's worn, as soon as the product is put on. So we generally want to have stance.idle or stance.standing or stance.sitting, obviously depending on what the animation is. So action type is going to be for our avatar, new ensemble, and in the asset we should see our sequence. There it is. So we'll set the start, end, which is 60 frames, and we'll do 0 loops. That's infinite. Everything else is okay. Click apply, and then what we need to do is preview. So remember that this is the empty mood, so the animation is supposed to automatically trigger when the product is worn. We can't use, for empty mood only, we can't use what we might otherwise do, which is a trigger word that has to be typed. So for the mood, when we're testing, we have to use stance.idle, and this will automatically initiate. So preview, and there is our sequence. So when we now want to add this to the avatar as a triggered pose, what we can do is create a new product. We can use female avatar or the male avatar, the base. So that's either, if we're using the PID, depending on what's shown here, we can search by PID, and that's 80 female or 191 for male. Either or, doesn't matter, because again it's the same skeleton, slightly different meshes. So select, derive. So it's got all the default textures, skeleton, meshes, and in the action, so we want to create a new one. Plus, new action, rename. This time we can use the trigger word, shrug, S-H-R-U-G, enter, action type, avatar, ensemble, new ensemble in the asset. So click on the list and it'll show all the currently existing avatar animations. So that's all the defaults. And then once we import our FBX, it'll be listed here as well. So that's the sequence. So let's just FBX import, shrug, open. Just quickly go through the import process. Set up FBX, no meshes, everything else is okay. Next, no materials, next, no morph, review. There is our sequence data, import. So it's brought it in. So back into component where we created our action. Make sure it's selected. New ensemble, because we didn't actually create one. Click on the list, and there is our sequence. So select, set the frames, 1 start, 60 end, and we'll just do this for one loop. Everything else is okay. Apply, preview. And then we can test the trigger typing in the box. And there is our triggered pose. And you note, as was mentioned previously or earlier, it only animates the bits that we exported, leaving everything else in place. So whilst he's in that pose, only the shrug animates, everything else remains the same. So it's using the default. Obviously the next step would be to save this and submit it to the catalog. But that's creating a pose in Blender using the Toolkit on macOS.